This meeting is now being recorded.
So now, with that, I would like to introduce Mark Goldstein. Mark is the Snow and Ice Program Coordinator at MassDot. So this is the guy before it starts to snow. He takes care of all of the roads, actually. So it's a pretty big responsibility. So with that, I'm going to move, and Mark's going to take over the place here. So hang in there. And again, if you have any kind of technical problems, try logging in again. If it doesn't work, just hold off until we post it, and you can view it then. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom Tagan. Good morning, folks. I got a chance to speak with you last year, and I'm excited to be back. For some reason, Tom couldn't suppress the camera this year, so my apologies. We'll try to get through this as best we can together. He said I'd take care of the roads statewide. I have help from thousands of people out there. We have 800 DOT employees and thousands of contractors that do this side by side and roll up our sleeves during a storm to keep the roads safe for Massachusetts people and other travelers as well. So we're going to get started with the presentation. And forgive me, I got to look down to some paper notes. So snow and ice removal, it's one of the most important things that we do at DOT, arguably the most important thing that we do because many people see it. It happens every day. We don't know when it's going to happen during the winter. So road construction, we try to minimize the impacts by staging that at night to the extent possible. But snow and ice, it's just going to happen when it's going to happen, and we try to do our best to keep the motoring public moving during it. So the agenda today, we're going to talk about some advantages of being proactive, a technique called anti-icing, which is relatively new in the snow and ice scheme. We'll talk about some of the tools that we use to achieve performance, such as new technologies, and where snow and ice operations are heading. They're heading into the future. We have several chemical options, and we utilize them depending on what factors make them the best technique to choose at that time. So we'll also talk about why we do some of the things that we do, and once the sun is shining and the temperatures are in the 60s, 70s, and 80s again in April, then we got to talk to regulatory agencies and clean up some of the messes that salt has caused us. So, it's serious, and we need to minimize those impacts, so we need to use as little salt as we possibly can. Thank you, Tom. Excuse me. So we try to use professionalism in our operations because we have DOT employees working side by side with thousands of contractors. During a maximum storm, we might have 165 depots in operation, and we have many, many people that need to coordinate with each other and respect each other during the storm. And we're working towards a common goal, which is keeping our roads clear for the Commonwealth. Integrity and accountability are very important to what we do, but I just skipped over established levels of service, documentation, state policy. We're going to talk about that extensively, levels of service, very shortly. Continued communications, again, we have thousands of people, and it needs to be a coordinated effort during a storm. So communications are key. We have radio rooms in each of the 6 districts and headquarters, and they're in sync and, moving around a lot of equipment, passing messages, getting emergency response to places where accidents might have happened. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes during a storm. What are levels of service? Levels of service are what we do to maintain certain roads, the length that we're willing to go through. In Massachusetts, we have a very high level of service for just about every road. We treat interstates and secondary and tertiary roads with the utmost respect, and they all get extensive treatments based on how the road is, what the condition of the road is. But all of these roads are cared for during a storm, and that can get to be a little expensive. We'll talk about public expectations. I think you know that a lot of people are used to the level of service, the high level of service that the Snow and Ice program delivers here in the Commonwealth, so they want to go quick during a storm, and that's why we try to remind them, don't crowd the plow. But the public expectations, they want to go 80 miles an hour as soon as the last snowflake has fallen. But we put these messages out there on the message boards, don't crowd the plow. There's a very important reason for that. When you see a battery of our plows in echelon formation, that means they're spread left to right across the roadway. They're actually passing thousands of pounds of snow from one truck to the other, and it's happening, and you can't really see around these trucks, and if you try to go in between them, It's very, very dangerous. So that's why we put those messages up. Don't crowd the plow. There are economic benefits and sheer necessities of keeping roads open in the Commonwealth. And that's why we get out there and we try to be proactive and get ahead of the storm. So we're going to talk about some things that happen if we lose roads, which we don't like to do. Remember the blizzard of '78? Most of you probably might be too young for that, but I remember it. I was a kid, but yeah, things were impacted for a while. I was out of parochial school for, I don't know, like a week. That was a lot of fun, playing King of the Mountain. All right, so in 24 hours, if we lose a road, you can read for yourself the things that will happen. They get to be serious the more and more time passes until we open a road. Food shortages will begin to develop. Hospitals start losing basic supplies. Mail gets impacted. Fuel availability becomes an issue. Now, what if we go 2 to 3 days? Garbage, sanitation, food shortages escalate. Supplies at grocery stores begin to disappear. The shelves come bare. ATMs running out of cash. Fuel situation gets worse. Container ships can't get unloaded. In a week, with no roads open, you're going to run out of gas. Hospitals run out of oxygen. Imagine how serious that would be. The nation's clean water supply will begin to run dry. This is serious stuff. All right, it gets worse. In 4 weeks, can't imagine this. GI, gastrointestinal illnesses increase. So the healthcare system will really be plummeting, and I imagine things will be really bad in a lot of different areas in 4 weeks with no open roads. So. All right, we'll talk about levels of service. We've been talking about different ways we can possibly save money in the Commonwealth because snow and ice, it's expensive, and it's the taxpayers' money. It's my money. It's your money. We're bound to do the most we can with that money. So levels of service are something that we've been discussing because, like I said, we go out there in a storm and we treat every road as if it's carrying the popo most. And, it could be. A loved one needs an emergency vehicle to pass so they can have rescue. So we like doing what we do for that reason, but it's hard to justify the cost of keeping certain segments of road open if nobody's traveling them, if you know what I mean. So several DOTs have been looking at levels of service that they provide during an event, and they've reduced some levels of service on certain roads in certain situations at certain times, so this reduces the resources needed during an event, but it takes time to get the road back. It takes more time to get the road back after that because you're going to have snow and ice bonded to roads, and we'll talk about how once the snow and ice is bonded to roads, it becomes much more difficult and expensive to get that off, okay? All right, so New Hampshire. Let's talk about what New Hampshire does. They do density-based level of service, so that means the roads that carry the most traffic, like interstate roads, get the most treatment, and other roads that have less traffic receive treatment more periodically, with a longer time span between treatments. Back in 1982, Vermont, I like what they did. They actually legislated a safe roads at safe speeds policy. So they recognize in Vermont that it's going to snow, and they recognize that people should drive a little slower, and they want their own people to drive a little slower. So they try to publicize this. Safe roads at safe speeds. I think it's a really good concept, and it's worth exploring. Like I said, people down here like to go 80 miles an hour, sometimes during a storm. So we're trying to throttle down the speed. Sometimes you see the state police reducing the speed on the pike to 45 miles an hour. They actually have the ability to do that statewide. We'd like to see more and more of that to keep people throttled down. So we use the variable message signs, the VMS boards, to try to relay that message. Just like don't crowd the plow, keep your speeds down, speed limit enforced. All right, so Colorado, what they do is certain roads that are barely traveled or very lightly traveled, like these red roads that you see on the slide here, they're not treating those. I used to live in Colorado. I can tell you that a lot of these roads are in areas that are very sparsely populated. Out east in Colorado, you're talking about farm country. So they'll let those roads go during the night and then get them back in the morning. Save some money. It's tough to justify treating some of those eastern plain roads, and there's just wind out there, and it's loading more snow back on the road, so wait till the morning. Makes sense. All right, we'll talk about some policy decisions. So when we go out there, we generally treat with 240 pounds of salt per lane mile. Lane mile is a 12-foot width. That's what you're used to, a lane mile or a lane width on a highway. That's approximately 12 feet, okay? So we try to put 240 pounds in that mile. Closed-loop controllers. They're required now for vehicles that we contract to do snow and ice work in the Commonwealth. We put them on our own spreaders as well. And what these closed-loop controllers do is they calibrate the material distribution from that spreader, from that material spreader, to the speed of the vehicle. So if the vehicle's not moving, it's sitting at a stoplight, you shouldn't see a little pile of salt building up at the back. You might have seen that in years past, but we're hoping you're not seeing that anymore, where a vehicle's not moving and salt is building up behind it, because that's a waste of money. And it's environmentally irresponsible. All right, so when are we going to apply the materials for the best results? We'll talk about that. We don't want to apply material before a very, very wet storm. If it's coming in very, very wet and not that cold and it's not freezing yet, we're going to just wash that material off the road. It's kind of a waste of money. So we're really looking at the latest forecasts. We're consulting all of our weather providing technologies. We have a weather provider that's really, really good. They're in Minnesota, but they pay such attention to detail in the Commonwealth that they can give us forecasts down to the 21 areas that we have in MassDot, spread out across 6 districts. So we have blue application guidelines. We publish these and provide them to staff, and it's just a reminder of what treatments are indicated by what conditions, like what meteorological conditions indicate what treatment. And generally, we like to stay at 240 pounds per lane mile. We want guys used to that. There are certain times when we'll have to increase that, like a freezing rainstorm. Those can become very serious, and sometimes you need to bump up the material application rate just to keep the public safe, and we recognize that, but we really like to stay at 240, and there are many reasons why, environmentally and operationally, and we'll talk about more of those. This just shows how many miles of treatment you can get from how many cubic yards of salt you have in a spreader. A cubic yard of salt is basically equivalent to a ton, so we normally have spreaders that can carry about 10 tons of salt, and they can go, if they're treating 240, they can go up to like 80 miles, so we can send them out on long runs, but they're generally not that long. All right, let's talk about a basic principle of snow and ice, being proactive. It's much easier to remove the snow when it's not frozen to the pavement, and this is why we want to get out there and be proactive. There's a big advantage to being proactive. We get the roads back sooner after a storm. We save money. We save material. There are so many reasons. De-icing is the old school approach. It's comparatively more expensive. It's a reactive approach. You're not being proactive. This means that snow and ice is falling on the road and you're waiting until it's packed up on the road, and then you're melting it from the top down, which is more costly. It costs 6 to 10 times more to melt snow from the top down than from the bottom up. The bottom up is anti-icing. We're going to talk more and more about anti-icing. But de-icing is when you got caught off guard, snow and ice bonded to the road, and now you got to get it off, so you got to burn it off with more salt. It's more expensive and cumbersome, and we don't really want to do that. Speaking of old school, take a look at this. We don't want to do things this way anymore. Not that we ever did. But you get the idea. Certain places in the country, they might not have the resources that we have here, and this is actually a fairly modern video. You'll see like a dash cam if we watch it long, but you get the idea. This isn't a very efficient practice, but these guys are arguably really good at what they're doing. All right, so we're going to show de-icing and anti-icing in the same slide. What you see here on the left is you have salt being sprinkled on top of the snow and ice. It's melting it from the top down. That's that reactive approach. It's de-icing. Whereas on the right, you see that a layer of brine has been established on the roadway. That's anti-icing. We want to get out there early, pre-treat if possible, and once the moisture hits the road, we're going to have that layer of brine. The brine stops further snow and ice from bonding to the roadway. So that's what we want to do. We want to establish a layer of brine early in an event, and then we're going to maintain that layer of brine with further treatments. Because the brine gets diluted. We'll talk about dilution of solution. All that means is this precipitation is going to dilute the salt. The salt's most effective at its concentration of 23.3% is the best concentration for brine. That's like a saturated salt solution. The modern approach, anti-icing. So again, it's being proactive. We're applying materials at the start of an event, and then we're going to supplement that brine layer with further treatment. And we're reducing the freezing point of water. That's what salt is all about. It's a freezing point depressant. Just like your antifreeze in your car, you're reducing the freezing point. Here's a picture of an anti-icing operation. Sometimes you might see this. You might say, hey, why is that truck out there 2 days before a storm laying down this salt? The salt's getting on my car. Well, we're being proactive, and this is a truck applying brine. You can see the sunshine. So, he's out there, but he's in advance of a storm. Brine gives us a lot of flexibility. It's 23.3% salt. That's basically what it is. You're spraying a very concentrated salt solution. It's much more concentrated than the ocean water, and we can manufacture this brine ourselves. We have capacity in District 5 down in Sagamore, and we're looking to build capacity statewide because this is an important tool, and it really gives us flexibility, especially at the beginning of a storm. We can mobilize equipment more safely, and the snow and ice isn't bonding to the road because we got out there and we got ahead of the storm. We put this material on the road, so it's just waiting for moisture, and we can put this out a couple to 3 days before a storm as long as it's going to be dry up until that storm. If you've got a rainstorm in between this period of time when you're putting this brine down and your winter storm, then you're not going to put this down and waste it, because if you've got a lot of wetness before a cold storm, then it's just going to wash the material off. So you're going to need to mobilize a little quicker if the storm's coming in wet, and then it's going to get cold because, pre-treating is kind of a waste of money in that situation. So anti-icing with brine. Application rate, so that truck that you just saw, he's putting down 20 to 30 gallons per lane mile, and that can last on the road up to 48 hours, a little longer if you know it's going to be dry. And you saw those spray lines once the solution dries, and you have to monitor it for dilution of solution. Again, that's why if it's coming in wet, you might not put this down because it's just going to dilute it away. This doesn't have the same chemical residue as mag chloride does. We'll talk about some of the limitations of mag chloride. We like to use that when it's very, very cold. Well, very cold. It's not very, very cold. There's narrow windows for when we can use certain materials, and we'll talk more and more about that. But brine is a little more flexible for pre-treating roads than mag chloride is for a few reasons. All right, anti-icing strategy. We don't want to over-apply mag chloride because we can make the road slick, and we'll talk about why. We only want to apply mag chloride when the road is below 32 degrees and falling, and not below 10 degrees, because it's really not effective below 10 degrees as a spray-on. It is hygroscopic. What that word means is mag chloride and calcium chloride, we used to use that before, will actually pull humidity out of the atmosphere and deposit it on the roadway. So you can do more harm than good if you're using mag chloride at the wrong time. If there's a ton of humidity in the atmosphere and the roads aren't the right temperature, you can really make them slick. So we really have to watch what we're doing with mag chloride. And we require pre-wetting of material. What that means is when we distribute salt on a roadway, we don't want to distribute it dry because it bounces, it scatters, it goes all over the roadway, and it really, really, really wants to go to the side of the road where it's doing no good. We need the road to have the salt on it, not on the sides, because if the salt is on the side of the road, it's just going to go to the groundwater before it gets a chance to do any treatment, and that's a waste of money and environmentally irresponsible. So what we do is we pre-wet the salt before it comes out of the truck with 8 to 10 gallons of mag chloride per ton of salt. We'll show you a little picture of that in a bit. There are benefits to anti-icing, of course. Like I said, we're going to get those roads back quicker than if we're de-icing, if we're melting from the top down. That's why we want to be proactive, produce that black and wet pavement right after a storm. We're used to that kind of level of service, and that's expensive, so we might be examining the way we do things in the future. We might, need a little more time to get roads back or certain roads back to motoring condition after a storm. So we're going to talk about that with you all in the years ahead. We're going to talk about what we're doing for levels of service and how we can modify our program to maybe save us all some money, because this is a very costly program to provide tremendous levels of service at all times. So we use less labor and fuel when we're proactive, anti-icing. We use less chemicals. That saves money and environmental impact. Wear and tear on equipment is lessened by using less materials and getting out there and being proactive. You're using fewer material hours or fewer material treatments because you were proactive, and you're using fewer equipment hours is what I meant to say. Excuse me. All right, so when do we decide to go out? Like I said, our weather provider can give us very extensive detailed reports down to the area. We've got 21 areas across the Commonwealth. We have a weather provider in Minnesota called DTN. They're very good at what they do, very conscientious. They get in touch with us whenever we need to be looking at something that we might not be aware of. We have pavement temperature devices. We have an extensive network of RWIS is what they're called, Roadway Information System. Road Weather Information Systems is really accurately what that acronym means. And we have a network of dozens of these across the Commonwealth, and they send us back all sorts of valuable information. Air temperature, pavement temperature, friction. Friction is what it's all about. There's a number, 0.82 is a coefficient of friction, and that's generally perfect grip. It actually goes up to 1, my boss reminded me, but that means that the tire is stuck to the pavement and can't move. So 0.82 is the best friction that we can get, and we're looking at that friction level reported back to us from our road weather information systems that are roadside, and some of these are actually integrated into the road. We have some sensors that are embedded in the roadway. We're moving more and more away from those because when we do milling and paving projects, we have to resurface the roadway. That means we're tearing up those devices and we have to replace them. And there are arguably better technologies available now, which are the non-invasive sites that we have statewide. And these sit on a pole, and they're focused with an infrared or laser beam down on the roadway, and they're reporting information and parameters back to us, and without being embedded in the road. They're non-invasive, so they're looking down at the road. And I'll show you a picture of one of those devices. And they're really cool. So they'll report the grip, and we can watch a graph of grip over time. And I was with our director of roadway operations the other day. His name's Scott Wilson, and he's into all these technologies. And he showed me a graph, and he could see where grip was plummeting because snow was piling up on one of our roadways. And then he showed me how a battery of plows came by, and this is synced up. So we're looking at the grip on the screen, and it dips down, and then the plows go by, and then the grip goes back up. And we can see that without looking at the picture, but we had the graph moving in real time, plus we had the plows, and we could see that when the plows went by, the grip was restored to the roadway. It was really cool. So technology is in the future, and it's going to help us. It's going to help us isolate treatment times better and save money because we don't want to go out at the wrong time, put too much salt down, put salt down at the improper time when it's too warm for it, when it doesn't need it. So we really need to be frugal with this material because there are a lot of consequences to it, and it's cost, it's environmental. So we want to make our decisions on the best information available at the time. So before a storm, our superiors are looking for a lot of information. And, those plans might divulge basic ideas about when different districts are going to mobilize for a storm based on when it's expected to hit that district. But these are subject to change, and everybody realizes that, and they modify their plans accordingly. And therefore, we don't want to call in equipment before we really need them because that gets expensive when our hired equipment is sitting around. So we try to minimize the time that they're sitting idle and make sure that we don't call in more equipment than we need. We really want to be efficient with our call-ins and with our material usage and everything we're doing in the program. We need to streamline it and be effective and save money, your money, my money, our money. Improve communications between districts. Like I said, we have radio rooms in the 6 districts, and they're constantly coordinating with each other, and within their own districts, they're calling in equipment, and they're divulging information. Emergency response is involved, and there's a lot going on behind the scenes in a storm, a ton. So these are the MassDOT districts. You can see there's 21 of them, I believe, and like I said, we get great information down to these districts. So we get a little more snow up here in the northern areas sometimes than the southern areas. That's just how it happens. We get some lake effect snows that come into District 1. Those Alberta clippers will come down from Canada and hit District 1. And, it'll be snowing here sometimes for a couple of days, and you have no idea because it's sunny out here. District 1 really gets a lot of snow. Let's talk about some treatment factors. Pavement temperature is the key to success. I'm sorry, I don't know what happened there. Road conditions, they basically will tell us when it's time to go out, but we use the technologies to try to give us a heads up. But it's not always just pavement temperature. It doesn't have to be snowing for us to need to be involved in snow and ice operations. If you have a roadway temperature that's below the dew point, that could be serious. If there's humidity, it's going to get on the roadway, and if that roadway and the dew point temperature happen to be below freezing, which is possible sometimes, then you ice up without anything on radar. So we really need to be aware of that, and a weather provider keeps us keyed into things like that. And you have other things like freezing fog. So what's happening with freezing fog is the air temperature gets below the dew point, and that pulls, or that makes the fog happen because what's happening is the moisture is condensing. That's what fog is. It's condensed moisture, and that'll drop on the roadway, and if the roadway is cold or freezing, we've got some serious stuff going on. So it's not always we're out there just when it's snowing. Sometimes we have to respond to an icing event that has nothing to do with precipitation. So precipitation type and storm length and intensity will dictate treatments that we perform, the timing, the magnitude, traffic volume, and timing. Those are some treatment factors. Sometimes we'll be a little slow with some treatments during the night hours, and we're getting equipment mobilized and in place so they can really do the best that they can before that rush hour. So we really need to be out there before you guys. So if a storm is active during rush hour, we're getting out there 2, 3 a.m., getting things ready, getting trucks loaded to be ready to get out ahead of the rush hour pulse, because we don't want to be stuck behind that. You got a battery of plows and spreaders stuck behind traffic. That's just not helping anybody. And you might have seen that before, but we try to minimize the occurrences of that at all costs. So we want to use all of these factors to our advantage in dictating treatments. I don't want to beat a salty horse, but why are we anti-ice? We're going to create that brine layer, and it allows the snow and ice to be moved off the road more quickly because it hasn't bonded. That's what it's all about, preventing this stuff from bonding, because then we have to burn it off. It gets more expensive. Our anti-icing strategy: when, under what conditions? Is the storm coming in dry? Then we can anti-ice. Okay, anti-ice, that's that pre-treating. Can I reapply? Yes or no, and why? Yes, you can, but again, you don't want to wash off your treatment, so you want to time them for when the salt's going to do the most good. So brine film maintenance, we got to get out there and maintain that layer. We got to put out salt after a storm has started and the precipitation is still falling, because the precipitation is diluting the salt, and then we're plowing some salt off the road, unfortunately. But that's just it's just going to happen sometimes. We're getting rid of some brine with our plow blade. And again, it's all about keeping that bonding minimized. We've got to prevent that bond. At lower temperatures, applications might need to be more frequent, but we're going to talk about how at very, very low temperatures, applications of material become needless. You're wasting material when it's too cold, and that's when we're going to get out there and push the snow with the plow blade, because otherwise it is wasteful, and I'll show you that. So dilution drives the application rate. If there's more moisture, you're going to need to apply more material. And this is what we're talking about in this bullet. More pounds per lane mile, more frequent applications. If we have like a freezing rainstorm, yeah, sometimes things get serious, and we're going to put out more than 240 pounds per lane mile, but there's a good reason why. It's needed. It's necessary. It's a safety factor. Okay, so why do we have to use chemicals? Why can't we just push? Because, again, you don't want that snow and ice bonding to the pavement. And that's going to happen during the temperatures when we should be out there treating. That's when that bonding happens. If it's too cold, the snow and ice isn't going to bond, and we can push it. But if there's freezing going on, active freezing going on, then it's an issue. We're going to need some chemicals and materials. So they help us clear the roads of snow and ice faster. We have a shorter work period if we get out there and be proactive and use these chemicals. We have fewer accidents, and we save more money. Excuse me. So we have a lot of materials available. We're going to discuss some of them. So we get in rock salt. Last year we used about 500,000 tons. That's a lot of tons of salt. Sodium chloride brine. Again, we can produce this at one of our facilities, but we ship it around statewide. And again, we want to increase capacity to manufacture brine in some of our other districts that are colder and more elevated, District 1 and 2. We're looking into increasing brine capacity there first, and that'll help out District 3 as well, because the shipping will be easier from 1 and 2 into 3 probably than from 5, which is down in southeastern Massachusetts. All right, blended brine. So that's 85% of the brine we just talked about, 85% of the 23.3% salt solution, and 15% mag chloride. Premix, if we've got stuff that's set up on the road, if we have snow and ice that's bonded to the road, this is the best stuff at burning it off, but it's pretty expensive. It's got 20% calcium chloride flake. It's very good as a de-icer. Then we have magnesium chloride. This is, I told you about this before, magnesium chloride. It's finicky to pre-treat with, but to pre-wet, pre-wetting the salt before it comes out of the spreader, that's a different story. It's corrosion inhibited, so that basically means there's an additive in there that'll keep it from increasing corrosion rates of metal surfaces that it touches. Equipment, roadways, there's things within the roadway, there's metal under the roadway that this stuff gets to, these salts get to, so we're trying to minimize corrosion whenever we can. That's a 26 to 30% solution of magnesium chloride. Sand, man, do you remember when we used to sand? That was ridiculous. We'll use it a little bit just to provide traction, spot traction, but it loses its angularity as soon as a few cars go over it. It becomes dull, and then we got to go out and clean it all up. It's going to get in the catch basins. We got to get it back in the spring. Some environmental agencies nationwide will actually make their snow and ice programs, their DOTs, pick up as much sand as they drop during a winter, and that becomes very difficult to do. We have to know how much of these chemicals to apply, when to apply them. We've got to pay attention to details when we're treating, focusing the salt on the road. You know, when you first look at this, you might say, oh, that's wasteful, but some communities do this, and what's happening here is you have the center of the road is slightly elevated, so they'll put material on the center of the road, so the moisture will hit the road, and then the material will spread across the roadway. But you don't want to do this too long before a storm, and that looks like it's been fairly dry applied, that stuff, because, you know, car tires are going to scatter that far and wide. We're going to talk about bounce and scatter and what cars and traffic do to salt and why we want everybody who's putting salt down for the Commonwealth pre-wetting their salt. It's very, very important. Salt causes corrosion issues, so we want to minimize the use of it for that reason. Yeesh. All right, take a look at this. On the vertical axis, the y-axis on the left, you've got pounds of ice melted per pound of salt. So the temperature is on the x-axis, the bottom axis. So look at 30 degrees right here. You can melt 46 pounds of snow and ice with 1 pound of salt at 30 degrees. At 25, look how it's dropped. It's almost only a third as effective at 25 degrees as that pound of salt at melting ice. Now you're melting 14 pounds. Look at this. When you get down to 5 degrees, 1 pound of salt melts only 4 pounds of ice. It's 10 times less effective than it was at 30, or 9 times, whatever, you know. But it's much less effective. And down here, this is when we're saying, save the salt, get out and plow. Put that blade down. What's our best snow and ice tool in frigid conditions? I just gave away the punchline. Remember him? Many of you probably don't. The plow blade is our best tool during frigid conditions. The plow. Ed McMahon, he made it in. Yes, you are correct. Well, okay, so what are you doing? We're plowing, not melting when it's below 15 degrees. Oh, I'm sorry, my mouse was frozen. Plowing is how we remove 90% of snow and ice in all temperatures. Spread patterns for the material distributors are critical. We don't want salt being spread where it's not useful. We don't want it on the side of the road. Okay, so calibration. Calibration of equipment is mandatory for all equipment that works for MassDOT. It's mandatory for all of our equipment too. So every year, all equipment is calibrated to ensure that it's distributing the proper amount of salt per speed or per unit of area that it's treating. Okay? How do we know when to apply salt? All right, again, salt is a freezing point depressant, and it needs to dissolve in order to work. And while it's dissolving and while this is happening, it's actually an endothermic reaction. So when you apply NaCl, sodium chloride, it actually needs heat from the atmosphere. It's endothermic. It requires heat and moisture to become effective. So it actually, gets a little worse before it gets better, but then it gets much better quickly. Comparatively, mag chloride, we pre-wet with mag chloride. We're pre-wetting that salt with mag chloride. And mag chloride is exothermic. Calcium chloride is exothermic. They actually dissipate heat as they're dissolving in water. So they're different animals than sodium chloride. So not all salts are the same. Okay, again, this is anti-icing. Pre-treating, spreading liquid chemicals before an event. We're going to form that brine layer. All right, again, if the brine film is maintained, the last flowering pass leaves a much cleaner road. All right, so let's talk about different chemicals and when they're best to use. So this practical melting temperature, I want to draw your attention to that. Sodium chloride, it works a little bit below 15 degrees, but you saw how ineffective it gets at lower temperatures. Mag chloride, this is what we pre-wet the salt with. It actually can get you down, get your protection around minus 10 degrees. Calcium chloride, minus 20 degrees. Calcium chloride gives you a great bang, but it's for more bucks, and it's a little cheaper for mag chloride, and mag chloride is suitable for the temperatures that we see in New England. New England, especially coastal regions, the temperatures are fairly moderated. How often do we get down below minus 10 Fahrenheit? So magnesium chloride gives us a lot of bang for the buck and less bucks than calcium chloride, which is why we switched from liquid liquid calcium chloride to liquid mag chloride years ago. Ever seen a phase chart? Basically, it's telling you that at different temperatures, different concentrations of salts are better. And basically, you want to stay in this period right here where melting occurs. If you got too little material for a temperature, too little salt, refreezing occurs in this range. Again, sodium chloride, optimum concentration 23% right here, percent by weight. So these are the temperatures again on these axes, Fahrenheit, Celsius here. You can actually have too much material harm your operations. If you have too much salt, it's going to be super saturated, it's going to freeze itself. So this is a dangerous area. This is where we want to live. This is our treatment triangle. So phase charts, this is basically expanding upon that. It just shows you the different treatment capacities of different materials. So look at calcium chloride. It can give you good treatment down to very, very cold temperatures, but it's quite expensive. So mag chloride, focus here, mag chloride on this curve, does a good job. It does the job that we need from it, and it performs at the temperatures that we see here in New England. It's not a waste of money. We're wasting money sometimes if we're buying calcium chloride because, it's over-treating things, and that costs more money. So pre-wetting, so you can see what's going on here. This is traditional pre-wetting. So the salt is coming out of the truck right here, and it's having mag chloride applied right here at a spray nozzle site. So mag chloride is coming out of a saddle tank down this tube right here, spraying out this nozzle. It's contacting this salt, and we're pre-wetting that salt with mag chloride. Again, 8 to 10 gallons of this mag chloride per ton of this stuff. So, excuse me. Why do we want to pre-wet? When you pre-wet the salt, a couple things happen. I think it's captured on another slide verbally, but the salt becomes activated. It's ready to do its job as soon as it leaves that truck. And it also keeps that salt on the road. So you're making that piece of salt adhesive, basically. You're giving it an adhesive texture, almost a sticky texture, and it's not going to scatter far and wide like dry road salt. If you apply dry road salt and you apply it too fast, either in a linear direction or if the spinner, the truck spinner that distributes the salt, that spreads the salt, if the spinner's going too fast, you're scattering it towards the sides of the road where it's not going to do any good. Again, we need to keep this salt focused on the road because that's where it belongs. We need to get the treatment out of the salt before it ends up in groundwater because then it's just expensive, it's just damaged us, and we didn't get any benefit from it. So all of the salt is going to end up in the groundwater. We need the bang for the buck before it ends up there. So look at this. If you don't pre-wet like we showed you in that last slide, if you don't do this, here's what happens. 15% is on this side of the road, off the road. 15% is here. So you got 30% of your salt on this side of the road. 46% stayed in the center, and you got some here treating lanes. However, 30%. Consider a year in which we might spend, $30 million in materials. 30% of that? So you basically put $10 million of salt on the side of the road where it didn't do anything before it ended up causing environmental impacts, costing us money. So if we don't pre-wet, 30% of our salt budget is going to end up on the side of the road. If we pre-wet, on the other hand, 78% stays in the middle. You got another 18% on these lanes. Only 2% on this side, only 2% on this side. So we're talking about 1.2 million, maybe something like that, much less than in the previous slide. You're talking about 10 million, 12 million bucks on the side of the road. So that's why we're going to pre-wet. We're going to keep it going. We're not going to stop. We're actually going to supplement the programs in the years ahead. You saw back here in this slide, excuse me for a second, you saw here that the salt is coming out, it's getting sprayed, but it's not contacting every surface of that salt crystal. We can do a better job with different technologies. There are things called slurry spreaders. They have an auger, or I always pronounce that funny. It's a corkscrew, basically, an auger in the bottom of the truck, and the corkscrew spins the material around in the mag chloride, so it's getting really, really saturated. It comes out almost like a paste, and you almost can't throw that off of the road. It's like almost dripping out of the vehicle, and that puts it on the road to stay. And I think ultimately that's the direction that we're going to go in. We're going to be using these slurry spreaders, but we have to build our liquid program because we need the liquid. We need much more liquid than we have capacity to store and distribute right now. So that's in the years ahead. But right now we're going to keep on pre-wetting the way we do, and we're not going to allow ourselves or our contractors to try to cut corners and not get out of their trucks and fill up those saddle tanks with mag chloride. It's tough to do sometimes, but they got to do it. They're signing a vendor agreement saying that they'll pre-wet our salt, and we're going to hold them accountable to that. Pre-wetting benefits: we can get higher levels of service, start melting the roadways faster, or the precipitation on the roadways faster. Pre-wetting helps us melt more with less material, less bounce and scatter. Again, the pre-wetting, it's about focusing that salt on the road. We need it on the road because, other things are going to scatter it, not just the linear and rotational velocity of that vehicle. Other vehicles that are traveling behind the salt spreader are actually going to spread that salt out, and we're going to talk about that. There was a bounce and scatter study done by the University of Michigan, and basically what they did was they treated 2 lane miles with 240 pounds of salt side by side. One 240-pound amount was applied dry applied. And then they pre-wet the other 240-pound lane mile treatment. And so what happened? Just after light traffic of 5 cars at 38 miles an hour, you lost 70% of that dry salt. You only lost 7% of that pre-wet salt. So that means 70% of the salt ended up scattered off the roadway by these 5 vehicles at only 38 miles an hour. Now, increase that to a metropolitan example, 100 vehicles at 38 miles an hour, you lost 85% of that salt that you didn't pre-wet. 85%. You have 6 times more pre-wet salt on the road. It's incredible. We're not going to use 6 times less salt if we pre-wet, but we're going to use about a half as much salt if we pre-wet adequately. And arguably, we're not pre-wetting adequately now. We need to really increase compliance and the buy-in, and we have technologies that we're instituting that are going to help us hold the contractors accountable to pre-wet. They're going to hold us accountable to pre-wet because we can see what these spreaders are doing from remote locations with these new technologies, and we're very excited about it. We're not trying to be Big Brother, but we need to know where our material and our assets are. All right, the future for snow and ice operations, it's coming, it's here. Closed-loop controls, we talked about that. They calibrate the amount of material distributed to the vehicle's speed, and this is very important. We don't want to waste salt. Like I said, when a truck gets stopped, you shouldn't see a salt pile building up at the back of it. We can save 30 to 50% of material spread if we're calibrated correctly. Mandatory pre-wetting, we've talked about this. I'm pounding that issue. Talking about that with contractors. We talked with about 900 contractors in the last 7 or 8 weeks at our tailgate training sessions. And this is where we get a chance to talk to guys who drive material spreaders, guys who load our material spreaders, like the front-end loaders that actually load the trucks. And we're trying to rein in material waste. We don't want to overload the spreaders. There's all sorts of things that go into keeping that salt in our barns, not wasting salt, keeping salt covered, not letting moisture hit it when it's not on the roadway, things like that. We have new technologies that we're examining, GPS AVL, which is the material tracking and location reporting. So it's telling us where the truck is, how fast his spinner's going, how many lanes he's treating, how much dry salt's coming out, what the pre-wetting rate is. We can learn so much from these GPS AVL material tracking systems, and we're really excited about that. And it's going to help us report to the regulatory authorities, the DEP, the EPA, how much salt we're using, down to the pound. So these technologies are exciting, they're emerging, and they're helping us, become more efficient and streamlined with our operations. So the snow and ice toolbox, we've got to use these things to our advantage. Excuse me. We want the best and most recent accurate weather forecasts. Our provider is really good at it. They're very good. Pavement temperature sensors, again, these can be invasive, the ones that are embedded in the roadway, or they can be non-invasive. We're moving to the non-invasives, and we're expanding our network, dozens and dozens of sites statewide. Road weather information systems, we talked about these, the RWISH stations. We have some stationary ones. We have a ton of stationary ones. And we have a few portable ones, too. And we have portable ones that you can mobilize at certain areas, and we also have portable ones that are fully portable that can attach to a vehicle. I have a pavement temperature sensor on my vehicle. Most of the supervisors statewide will have pavement temperature sensors on their vehicles. Arguably all roadway supervisors should have those devices. I think we all do. So materials, salt and premix. Premix is that stuff that we talked about before that was 20% calcium chloride flake and 80% regular NaCl, sodium chloride. That premix is what we burn off spots that happen to bond to the pavement. Snow and ice has bonded, premix will burn it off. And we have the liquids that we talked about, the brine, the liquid magnesium chloride. So we utilize equipment, spreaders and plows. Spreaders basically are distributing material out the back of the vehicle, and they're plowing in the front of the vehicle. Plows aren't distributing materials, they're just plowing. So what we don't want is we don't want plows coming around and scraping material that we just distributed on our roadway off the roadway. So the spreaders come out, the plows used to come around before the spreaders come out again. That's the old school way we used to do it, where the spreaders would go out. Let me try to say it again. The spreaders would go out, and then the plows would go out 180 degrees in a route behind them. And if you didn't coordinate it perfectly, you'd have the plows catching up to the spreaders, and it just wasn't the right thing to do. So now we have the material spreaders in formation, so they're putting material out while snow is being removed from the roadway. So the whole operation's happening at once. They're plowing with the front of the vehicle, and the back of the vehicle, or the back of the operation, is distributing the material. So, there's very little waste. We minimize the waste of the salt with that kind of operation. We utilize personnel. We have expertise out there. Again, we might have 750, 800 MassDot people supervising the operations, and we have many, maybe as much as 4,000 contractors during a maximum event with their pieces of equipment, and they're coming to work for us. We're working together towards a common goal.
Mark, can I ask a question?
Of course.
Is there a tool that the state employees at a facility, if they're doing their parking lots or driveways or stuff like that, is there like an infrared gun that they could buy that would actually give them the pavement temperature?
Yes. You can definitely have an infrared gun, handheld model, battery operated.
Yeah.
And, we can run one of our vehicles through the lot and, take a quick temperature reading. But that's a good point. When we mobilize equipment and they're coming to the depots, often the depots haven't been treated. So they're coming in, and they got to be really cognizant and aware of they might have slick pavement underneath them early in the operation. So we need to treat our yards and then get out there and treat the roadways.
Yeah, the other point I was going to make is that I'm thinking back to my facility management times, and a lot of times we would have in our contract, we would tell a vendor, show up after 2 inches of snow and start plowing at that point. And it sounds like I would make a different contract now, which would be pre-treat the parking lot at some point and then come in and plow less off. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Tom. I think you use less salt overall if you pre-treat the parking lot.
Right.
And, the weather factors play into it as well, so you want to pre-treat a parking lot when the meteorological conditions leading up to that storm, dictate it. So if it's coming in very wet and warm, you might not pre-treat.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so eyes are a very important tool to use. A lot of the people that supervise, a lot of the people that we call in, they've been doing this for a long time, and they're experts in it. They know the routes that they're treating. They know the slick spots. They know where snow and ice are going to set up early and maybe remain later than other spots. They know places where water might seep, and they might need more treatment in those spots. These are tow plows. They can actually do 2.5 lanes with one truck. They're pretty neat to watch in operation. We have like 17 of these across the Commonwealth. This is a picture of our brine plant, but you can't see everything. Believe me, there's a lot of guts to this operation. It's a really technologically advanced brine making facility. It's quite complex and sometimes difficult to run and finicky. And we're installing a couple of more simple systems in the future, believe me. But these are very highly technologically advanced contraptions. You're dumping the salt in here, and then a 23.3% solution, a saturated solution, will be achieved in this brine maker. Okay, these are the non-intrusion friction meters that we talked about. This is an ROS station. It's hovering above a roadway. We can put these on VMS boards, variable messaging signs. We can put these on traffic camera poles. And they tell us a lot of things. Again, they're telling us the temperature of the air, the temperature of the roadway, the dew point. They're telling us a lot of parameters that guide our treatment decisions. They're telling us the grip. That's a very, very important parameter, arguably the most important parameter, and we're going to be using it more and more in the future to dictate when we're going to go out. It's going to be grip-based more than timing and eye-based. Excuse me.
There's a question there. Tony Santos, if you want to read that.
Would DOT be able to share the RFP they send out for vendors? Sure. Actually, I can give Tom our website that the vendors actually can contact our vendor agreement. So they look up the vendor agreement, they look up the different attachments that they need, they look up the submission deadlines, and it's a process, and it begins in September, and sometimes a little bit earlier. We're really getting ready for snow and ice during the summer when it's warm. These guys are getting their ducks in a row. I'm sorry. Okay. All right. These guys are getting their ducks in a row. And oops. I'm just going to shut that box. All right. So yeah, we will share that. The vendor agreement. All right, segmented plow blades. These are basically newfangled blades, and they're different than the old steel blades that we used to use. Those were just a cutting edge. These might have a carbide insert. They're segmented, which means that instead of mechanics changing a dangerous, heavy 11-foot section of steel, they're able to change 2 4s and a 3. It's a lot easier. Less vibration from these things. The drivers like them. This is the future and in the present of our snow and ice operation blades. 3 T's. Timing's everything. Be prepared. Don't get caught off guard. Trust the technology, the new gadgets. They do work. Training, it's essential at all levels. Like I said, we've trained about 900 vendors this season or this autumn. It's still meteorological autumn. Can you believe that? It's going to be winter soon, but it's here. It's here. So we also train 800 of our staff this autumn. We also have timekeeper training, which is training the supervisors on how we call in equipment, how we pay equipment. We've got to be open to new ideas because they're going to save us money in the future and they're going to make a roadway safer for less money. Now we're going to talk about the back end of the operation. This is when it gets a little warmer. Well, we're worried about salt use during the winter. Trust me, we're thinking about it every day, how we can use less salt. But we need salt in our operation. It's probably here to stay in some capacity, and it causes environmental impacts on the back end. Basically, you have a picture of an ecosystem here, and the salt that we distribute on the roadways makes its way through those ecosystems. It's going to end up in the water table. It's going to end up in the groundwater, and the groundwater might be going to somebody's well nearby, drinking water well. Sometimes that's not good. So we have a salt remediation program in MassDOT's Environmental Services, and it's about 1 to 2% of our budget annually. So we might spend $1 million, $1.5 million, sometimes $2 million. It's getting really expensive, and it's one of the reasons why we really need to control our salt usage. We need our contractors understanding that. We need to use as little salt as we can to treat the roadways effectively. And it's not just our contractors, it's our employees. It's employees that might be treating facility parking lots. It's big box stores that are putting a lot of salt, too much salt, and they might have wetlands nearby. And that salt's going to run right into those wetlands and into groundwater. But they're trying to mitigate the damage claims, the slips and falls, the personal injury liability, and they're doing it with salt. And we need to really be efficient with salt because The groundwater doesn't really know that, hey, it's a big box store doing it, or it's a DOT putting this salt in the water, or it's a town that's using too much salt. So we're trying to do things to minimize our salt use, and one of them is we're trying to minimize overlaps, like where we might be going over a road and putting salt down. We need to make sure that a town's not doing the same thing on that same stretch of road. Sometimes we need to go over a stretch of road that a town treats before we can get to a roadway that's past that where we treat. So we need to really be conscientious and cognizant of that. We need our operators aware of where they're supposed to be treating, where they're not supposed to be treating, and we really need to reduce those overlaps where you're getting double treatment, because we just can't afford that. Some of the environmental impacts associated with road salt use. Our water resources get hit. Aquatic life, they don't like chlorides. They can be toxic. Species can start to become impacted. Their reproductivity can be harmed. Agriculture. So, our salt remediation program is addressing concerns of a farm that's surrounded by 3 state roads out in the Pioneer Valley, and they're talking about how the cows can't drink the groundwater, and some of their equipment is becoming fouled by the chlorides that are in the groundwater, and it's a serious, serious thing. If we're using too much salt, it can affect infrastructure. And let's talk about infrastructure. So remember that Flint, Michigan thing? The environmental people got me aware of this a little more. That Flint, Michigan situation where there was very toxic levels of lead in their drinking water, it's not necessarily because there was lead in the reservoir, all right? Suppose that water is very high in chlorides from snow and ice treatment or, man-made chloride. All chlorides are pretty much man-made inputs into water. You get chloride into the pipes, the lead pipes that go into some of these old houses, the chloride liberates the lead. So that's what's happening there. You got the chloride liberating the lead. So there's a lot of things that you got to think about when you're using sodium, when you're using chlorides. Vegetation, you don't want to stress the vegetation out, and we'll have a better picture in a minute. Stress vegetation, there it is. You can see that these trees are suffering maybe from roadway impacts in some mountain community in West Virginia. Environmental fate of road salts. You can take a look at this on your own, but basically it's all ending up in the groundwater. Impact to vegetation, soil, groundwater. Toxicity to aquatic life, streams, lakes, wetlands can suffer. Drinking water supply. You've got people on well water all over the Commonwealth, and we have to dig them a new well if we followed their old well, or we need to connect them to water, town water. That's expensive. We have communities, entire communities, that are looking at us to hook them up to the Quabbin. That's incredibly expensive. It can be like a $5 million hit. We can't do that very easily, so we need to be environmentally responsible with our salt, and we're trying to use less for those people, for those communities, and there are other reasons. Health concerns. If you're on a sodium-restricted diet and you're getting too much sodium in just your drinking water, we're trying to prevent things like that. People with high blood pressure, hypertension, kidney disease, heart disease. We talked about the cost of corrosion from salts and the corrosivity on those lead pipes. Hopefully communities are getting away from lead pipes. It's hard to believe that that's what we did. But some of the older communities still have some lead distribution. Aesthetics, taste. You don't want to taste salty water. Nobody does. Or chloride-laden water. Let's talk about this. You know those white buckets, a 5-gallon bucket of water? 1 teaspoon can contaminate that beyond drinkability standards that DEP might have. DEP has, I believe, 20 parts per million, or that's 20 milligrams per liter standard for drinking water. And to get over that, or to be above that contaminant threshold, which is mostly taste-based, it's not so much health-based, but again, health is an issue. It only takes 1 teaspoon of salt to contaminate that 5-gallon bucket of water beyond drinkability. So, we're talking about a 10 cubic yard, again, a 10-ton truckload of salt. So that's what's in one of those spreaders that you see on the road distributing materials, about 10 tons at the beginning. For every one of those truckloads that we can save this winter, instead of just sending it out for a needless treatment and it comes back empty, if we can save just 1 trip with that 1 truck, you're protecting 8 million gallons of drinking water. That's 12 Olympic swimming pools that can be subject to contamination from 1 truckload of salt. It's unbelievable. So there are about 156,000 teaspoons of salt in a cubic yard. If you ever needed to know, there's actually a conversion available for that. let's talk about this. This is a little complicated, but I want to talk about it for a minute. So basically, we compare our salt usage here on the y-axis to the severity of a winter. We had a consultant help us to devise something called a winter severity index that a lot of other state agencies use to assess their treatment effectiveness. So a winter severity index means this. As we go from here, 0, to over here, -30, the winter becomes more and more severe. So 2012, 2016, very mild winters. They're statistically insignificant winters because so little moisture fell in those years, so they kind of stick out. But this is old school, these blue points. As the winter becomes more severe, we look at how much salt we use. So in 2006, for this severity of winter, like a mid-range winter, you go up to this line, and this is about how much salt you should be using. So basically, this line is a linear regression. It's a very strong relationship between winter severity and the number of tons of salt used per lane mile in that winter. So as the winter becomes more severe, it's a directly proportional relationship. You're going to use more salt. So before 2011, when we started pre-wetting, pre-treating, making sure trucks were calibrated every year, these are the best management practices that we're using now, BMPs that we're using now, the pre-wetting, the calibration, the pre-treatment. Before we did that, this is our baseline, these blue data points. So those blue data points yielded this regression, which basically predicts during a winter of X severity how much salt you're going to use, okay? So you can see that the steeper this slope of this line becomes, man, the more salt that we're using for the severity of a winter. So what we're looking for from these BMPs, from the pre-treatment, from getting out and being proactive, from the calibration, from the pre-wetting, we're looking to lessen the slope of that relationship between winter severity and salt usage. So you can see for yourself how, just imagine a line of best fit with just these red data points, how the slope of that line is falling. And in the next several years, we're going to see the slope of that line fall even more because we're becoming more efficient with the salt that we use. So let's compare a couple of winters. At the bottom of the screen, we're going to compare 2003 to 2011. So look at my little cursor here. 2003 and 2011 were basically similar severity winters. So about -25, fairly severe winters. So that's why they're about here on this scale. So in 2003, we used this much salt. 50 tons per that lane mile. Over 50 tons per that lane mile. 53 tons per that lane mile. What do we use in 2011? In 2011, we only used 35 tons for that same lane mile. So it's a 34% reduction. And let's look at another comparison. 2005 to 2015, here's 5, here's 15. They're fairly similar winters, or quite similar winters in terms of severity. But in 2015, we used 26% less salt than we did in a similar winter in 2005. We're getting better at what we do, but we can get better. And, you know, we need our own help. We need our own buy-in. We need our other workers, our hired workers, to buy into this as well. Because, you know, it's what we need to do to use the Commonwealth's resources effectively, frugally. So we take a proactive approach to snow and ice. It saves us money, helps us minimize the environmental impacts. Some of the measures that we take to help achieve this are our best management practices that we've talked about. Good housekeeping, making sure that there's not just salt on the ground being wasted outside of our barns, getting rained on, going into the groundwater. Some people call them barns salt sheds is a more common term probably. We don't want the spreaders getting overloaded because an overloaded spreader, it takes a right-hand turn out of one of our depots. It drops a berm of salt on the ground. That's dangerous, environmentally irresponsible, and operationally, it's a waste of money. So we don't want our spreaders getting overloaded. So we try to tell our loader operators, do not overload the spreaders. We're looking at you to help prevent that, loader operator. Training. We talk to these guys a lot. Last year we got to speak with them. This year I told you we spoke with 900 of them. They're coming to these trainings, and you know we're increasing their awareness of the repercussions of oversalting, and we're trying to really use less salt. Reduce salt zones. We have some of these around the Commonwealth. There are areas where drinking water has been impacted, and we have to use less salt in those areas. But to keep those roads safe, sometimes we need to go out and treat a little bit more. So there is a trade-off. Gate openings. The salt comes out the back of a truck, and that gate opening needs to be calibrated for the amount of distribution that is desired. So We need those gate openings at their proper calibrated heights, and we keep on reminding these drivers of the material spreading units that they need to check their gate height and make sure that they're at their proper gate height. Because if that gate height should be 2.5 inches and it's 5 inches, then you're spreading twice as much salt as you should be per lane mile. So we need these guys always being aware of what their gate height is and what their proper calibrated gate height is, and that's what we need when they're on the road, spreading salt. Again, we talked about this. We need to avoid salting overlaps, places where we distributed salt and then we distributed it again, or another agency distributed it again, double treating the same area. Operational improvements. We talked about the new technologies, closed loop circulation, closed loop controllers. That's, again, where the speed of the truck dictates the material distribution rate of that truck. The faster the truck's going, the more material's coming out. But we want these spreaders, these material spreaders, we only want them going 25 miles an hour, 30 miles an hour tops, because, again, the faster they go forward, the more the salt wants to spread to the sides of the road. We talked about GPS AVL, material tracking, and we're looking at front-end loader scales. So what these front-end loader scales tell us is how much material went into that truck that was just loaded by the front-end loader. So we have different measurements for how much salt was loaded into a truck and how much salt came out of that truck with the closed-loop controller. That'll report how far a truck went in that event, how much salt came out of that truck, how many gallons of pre-wet mag chloride came out of that truck. We ask that the drivers put this information at the end of the storm, but GPS AVL material tracking is going to report that to us now and in the future, because we have it on some trucks now. A few dozen of our vendor vehicles now have this capability. And in the future, all of our material spreading fleet is going to have this closed-loop calibration coupled with material tracking, which is going to directly report to us over the cloud via modem how much material is coming out of these trucks. So we can hold them accountable to their material usage. Calibration, we've talked about that. You need to know how much material is coming out of that vehicle. Pre-treating, pre-wetting. And we've talked about those extensively, and I hope they sank in. ROS, the road weather information systems. We're beefing up that network. All right, a summary. New policies and equipment utilized in the last 7 years have resulted in more efficient use of road salt. So, again, go back to that graph of salt use versus winter severity. I overshot it, so bear with me. I'll be there in a second. Go back to this. We're getting better at what we do. The slope of this line the relationship between winter severity and salt usage is going down. We're going to keep making that line go down. All right, statewide data suggests a 28% reduction in the data from 11 to 17 based on 2001 to 2010. Those were those dark data points, the ones that we used to derive that original linear relationship. So, 3 most effective measures that we're working with right now: pre-wetting, pre-treating, and closed-loop controllers. That's the ones that calibrate the material that comes out to the speed of the vehicle. Reminders, we want to keep focusing on the best management practices and good housekeeping, not leaving salt out. That's the good housekeeping. Getting the salt back in. Not spinning off salt on the way back. Like, suppose a guy just got done treating his route. We don't want him coming back or driving back towards the shed and spinning off his salt. He's on somebody else's route maybe. He might not be on his own route, and there's no reason for it. There's no basis for spinning that off. You've got to come back to the shed, spin it off inside here. And then we're going to get this salt, we're going to sweep it back in here. We don't do things like this anymore. We try to minimize it. These are our newer sheds. And these are pretty exciting. The loader can go right in here. He's got a big pile of salt here. And he's able to actually load a truck that pulls into here. It's pretty neat stuff. And that can really lessen the impact from salt being loaded outside. And we're trying to do that. And we talked about gate openings. That's where the salt comes out the back of the truck. It's got to be at the proper height. We've got to pay attention to details. Again, minimize those overlaps of material distribution. And we need consistency with material data reporting. That's why we need this data reported directly to us, not from these guys writing it down. And that's the future, and we're working towards that right now. We're held accountable for our actions. We really are. We speak with the DEP and the EPA, and we're having discussions with them as soon as Monday. And as recently as a few weeks ago, we speak with a lot of conservation commissions, and we have to justify our salt use, and there are good reasons for it. We talked about the repercussions of over-salting needlessly. It's going to snow. It already is. So I'm wondering if you have any questions, and thank you for your patience in dealing with the can.
You can use the comment section to post a question if you'd like to.
Somebody had no sound. Loud and clear. We can hear. We're going to send the RFP. If there are no other questions, I want to thank you for your time. It's been a lot of fun talking to you guys, and I hope you got something out of this. So one moment, please. Tom Kagan will close this up.
Okay, well, thanks again for everybody's time. We will be recording it and posting it on the MAFMA website under trainings. That's where we're putting all of our presentations now. And again, I want to thank Mark so much for coming here and spending the time here. You know, a lot of the things at MassDOT, they're the experts, and so we, as facility people, we should be trying to embrace a lot of those things. I think there's some pretty good ideas about that. And I wanted to add, too, we did this presentation last year and talked a lot about pre-wetting, and a couple of agencies, and I know Holyoke Soldiers Home specifically, they actually went out and readapted their salt spreading trucks with some tanks on the side, which you can do, and then you can stop pre-wetting. And I know that they saved a lot of money doing that, and probably had a much more effective application, as you know, Mark's gone over quite nicely on that. So you want to think about that. If you're doing the work yourself and you have trucks and you're not pre-wetting, there are ways to adapt your trucks to do that. And again, I think it's really important because, you know, as I said before, you know, I hired vendors to do that, but now we want to make sure that the vendors that are out there, maybe on OSD contracts or ones that we get separately, that they're aware of the new systems and things like that, and we should be incorporating those into our contracts. So again, thank you very much. Keep in mind the webinars. If you're on the listservs, you'll get information on all the upcoming trainings. If you're not on the listserv, if you're like, you know, facility staff and someone else is getting the information, anyone can get on the listserv that works for the Commonwealth. You simply just have to send me an email with your email address, and we'll even put your personal email address on if you don't have a state email address. And then any MAFMA notifications will go out directly to you so that you get an opportunity to go on that. And just if you're looking for me in the global, you would get it under Francis, FRANCIS .Tagan, TAGAN @state.ma.us. And so with that, I'm sure Mark appreciates all the thank yous. You've been doing a lot of good good responses here. I thank everybody for their time again, and we will be closing out. Have a good weekend, everyone. Thank you. Perfect. Excellent job.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Tom. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Wow. All right.
I'm impressed. I mean, you guys are